History is not a book written in neat chronological order. It is a whisper carried on the wind, a stain on the soil that never quite washes away. It lives in the spaces between the floorboards of old houses, in the mournful sigh of the willow trees, and in the memories that people are too afraid to speak aloud. And in the heart of Alabama, in the year of our Lord 1847, a story was being written not in ink, but in blood and shadow. A story that the land itself would try to forget. Our story begins in Veridian County, a place carved from the dense, humid wilderness, where the air in summer is so thick with the scent of magnolias and sweet decay, you can almost taste it. Here, the cotton fields stretched to the horizon, a sea of white gold that was both the lifeblood and the curse of the region. The sun beat down with a relentless biblical fury, bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy blue and baking the red clay earth until it cracked like old parchment. In this world of stark contrasts, of opulent white columns and weathered slave cabins, of genteel manners and brutal truths, stood Blackwood Manor. Even by the standards of the era, Blackwood Manor was a place apart. It was not just a plantation, it was a kingdom ruled by an iron will. Perched on a low rise overlooking the murky waters of the Serpent Creek, the house was a grand Gothic revival anomaly. Its dark cypress wood, weathered to a deep, brooding gray, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Gables as sharp as daggers pointed toward the sky, and its windows, tall and narrow, watched over the fields like the vacant eyes of a skull. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones. They said the air grew colder when you passed its gates, that the songs of the field hands at Blackwood were always in a minor key, a sorrowful hum that the wind carried for miles. They said the shadow of the house stretched a little longer, a little darker than any other. For a generation, the master of this kingdom had been Theron Blackwood, a man whose ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the land he commanded. He had built his empire on two things: cotton and control. But in the spring of 1847, a fever, swift and merciless, had taken him from this world, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than any of his shouted orders had ever been. He left behind his wife, Elara Blackwood, and their two sons, Nathaniel and Elias. And it is with Elara that the true darkness of our story begins. Elara was not a woman born of the soft southern gentry. She was from the north, a woman of pale porcelain skin and hair the color of polished jet. Her eyes were a startling icy blue, and they missed nothing. When she had arrived in Alabama as Theron's young bride, her beauty was a subject of marvel, but it was a cold beauty like that of a winter rose encased in ice. She moved through the oppressive southern heat with a grace that seemed unnatural, never a drop of sweat on her brow, her posture always as rigid and perfect as a marble statue. While Theron had ruled the fields with his booming voice and heavy hand, Elara had ruled the house with a chilling, whisper-thin efficiency. She was the mind to his fist, the silent, calculating intelligence behind the throne. In the weeks following Theron's death, the people of Veridian County expected to see a widow in mourning, a woman broken by grief. They saw no such thing. Elara wore the traditional black, but it seemed not a color of sorrow, but of authority. It made her pale skin look almost luminous, her blue eyes more piercing. She did not weep at the funeral. She stood at the graveside, a black-veiled sentinel, her gaze fixed not on the coffin being lowered into the red earth, but on the horizon, on the endless rows of cotton that were now hers. The silence that fell over Blackwood Manor was not one of grief. It was one of transition. The king was dead. The queen had taken the throne. Her sons watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and unease. Nathaniel, the elder at 21, was his father's son in flesh and spirit. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a practical, unyielding mind. He understood ledgers and crop yields, the brutal arithmetic of their world. He saw his mother's cold composure as strength, a necessary fortitude to protect what his father had built. He sought to emulate it, to become the new master she would need by her side. Elias, 2 years younger, was a different soul entirely. Where Nathaniel was earth, Elias was water. He had his mother's dark hair, but his father's softer brown eyes, eyes that saw too much, felt too deeply. He spent his time not with the overseer, but in the library, with books of poetry and philosophy, or walking the damp, shaded banks of Serpent Creek. He had found his father's rule distasteful, a necessary evil he tried not to contemplate. But his mother's new silence? It was something else. It was a vacuum, a cold and watchful void that terrified him more than any rage. He saw the way she looked at the servants, the enslaved people who were the foundation of their wealth. Her gaze was not one of disdain or even cruelty, but something far more chilling, appraisal. She looked at them as a farmer looks at livestock, as a carpenter looks at wood, as a resource to be managed. The air in the house grew thick with unspoken things. The evenings were the worst. The family would gather for dinner in the grand dining hall, the long mahogany table a polished, empty expanse between them. The only sounds were the scrape of silver on porcelain and the ticking of the great-grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against the silence. Elias would try to meet his mother's eyes, but it was like looking into the depths of a frozen lake. She was there, but she was gone. The turning point came on a humid evening in late July, when the air was still and the night was alive with the frantic, chittering drone of cicadas. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the distant rumble of thunder a low growl in the belly of the sky. Elias summoned her 2 sons to their father's study. The room had remained untouched since Theron's death. It smelled of old leather, bourbon, and the faint, sweet scent of his cigars, a ghostly trinity that hung in the heavy air. His massive oak desk stood against the far wall, a monument to the man who had once commanded their world from behind it. But tonight, it was not empty. Elara was seated in his high-backed leather chair, not perched on the edge, but leaning back as if she had been born to it. On the desk before her was not a Bible or a book of poetry, but the Plantation Ledger. Its thick, leather-bound cover was open, and the pages were filled with her husband's spidery, aggressive script, names, ages, prices, and yields. Nathaniel stood tall and straight, his hands clasped behind his back, ready to receive his orders. Elias lingered by the door, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He watched his mother's slender white fingers trace a line of names in the book. "Sit," she said, her voice calm and even, betraying no emotion. It was a command, not an invitation. The boys obeyed, taking the 2 smaller chairs that faced the desk, chairs where they had so often sat as children to be lectured or disciplined by their father. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of a page as Elara turned it, and the rising moan of the wind outside. "Your father," she began, her gaze still fixed on the ledger, "built an empire. But he was a man of appetites. He spent lavishly, he gambled, and his investments in the new shipping ventures were unwise." She finally lifted her eyes, and the cold intensity in them made both sons flinch. "He left us with a legacy, yes, but he also left us with a great and terrible debt. The banks in Mobile are patient, but their patience has a price. Another poor harvest, another dip in the price of cotton, and Blackwood Manor will be carved up and sold off piece by piece. We will lose everything. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. We can cut expenses, Mother. Sell some of the outlying lands. I can be more forceful with the overseer. The yield will increase. Elara proffered a faint, dismissive smile. It did not reach her eyes. Those are the actions of a man trying to plug a leak in a dam that is about to burst. What we need is not a temporary fix. We need a new foundation. We need an asset that appreciates, that multiplies, that cannot be taken by bankers or ruined by weather. Her fingers came to rest on a list of names under the heading, Inventory, Female, Breeding Age. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He knew with a sickening certainty what was coming. Our most valuable asset, Elara continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, is our stock. A healthy servant can fetch $1,000, sometimes more, in the New Orleans market. One of strong build, light skin, and domestic training, considerably more. We already sell the surplus, Nathaniel said, his voice clipped and businesslike, though even he seemed unsettled by the direction of the conversation. Selling surplus is surviving, Elara corrected him, her voice like the hiss of a snake. I am talking about creating a product, cultivating it, perfecting it. For years, your father was content to buy new stock, to let nature take its unguided course. It was inefficient, random. We have been leaving our greatest potential to chance. She closed the ledger with a soft, final thud. The sound echoed in the silent room. We will no longer leave it to chance, she declared. We will create a new line, a Blackwood line. Stronger, more resilient, more valuable. Nathaniel stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean, Mother? Use the overseer? A prized buck from another plantation? It's common practice. Elama's cold smile returned, this time with a sliver of something that looked like triumph. No, outsiders are a risk. Their lineage is unknown, their health uncertain. The quality is not guaranteed. She paused, letting the weight of her words fill the room, letting the thunder roll closer. She then looked directly at her eldest son, her eyes boring into him. The implication, so monstrous, so unthinkable, hung in the air between them. It took a moment for it to solidify, to become real. Elias felt a wave of nausea. He felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. Nathaniel was the first to speak, his voice a choked whisper. Mother, what are you saying? I am saying, Elara said, her voice now as sharp and cold as ice. The charred future of this family requires a sacrifice. It requires your strength, Nathaniel, your vitality. And yours, Elias. You are Blackwood men. You will provide the seed stock. You will ensure the continuation of our legacy in the way that is now necessary. The clock ticked, the thunder cracked directly overhead, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the window panes like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. Elias found his voice first, a strangled, horrified gasp. No, you cannot be serious. That is a sin. It is an abomination. It is a business decision, Elara countered, her tone unwavering. Do not speak to me of sin. Sin is allowing your father's name to be dragged through the mud of bankruptcy. Sin is allowing this house to fall into ruin. Sin is weakness. What I am proposing is survival. She stood up, her movements fluid and deliberate, and walked around the desk to stand before them. She placed a cold hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. He trembled but did not pull away. Think of it, Nathaniel, a new generation of servants born on our soil, bearing a superior strain. They will be stronger, more intelligent, more obedient. They will be ours in every sense of the word. Our wealth will not just be restored, it will be guaranteed for generations. She spoke as if she were discussing the breeding of fine horses or prized hounds. Elias shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the wooden floor. They are people! They are women, Mother, not cattle! They have souls! Elara turned her gaze to him, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed her face. Contempt. A soul is a luxury we can no longer afford, Elias. A soul does not pay a creditor. A soul does not pick 1,000 pounds of cotton. What they have is a purpose, and we will provide it. She walked to the window and looked out at the storm-lashed grounds, at the rows of cabins where the subjects of her grotesque plans slept, unaware of the fate being decided for them. "The first will be Seraphina," she said, her voice distant, as if the matter were already settled. "She is strong, healthy, and has a compliant nature. Nathaniel, you will be first. It is your duty as the eldest." And there it was, the plan, laid bare in all its monstrous logic. A scheme born of desperation, pride, and an inhuman coldness that defied comprehension. It was a poison that, once spoken, could never be taken back. It seeped into the very foundations of the house, into the hearts of the two young men who were now being asked to become monsters in the name of legacy. Nathaniel stood frozen, trapped between his ingrained duty to his mother and the profound revulsion at her command. Elias looked from his mother's rigid back to his brother's tormented face, and he felt the world fracturing around him. This was not survival. This was the damnation of them all. The storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest in the room. The wind moaned through the eaves like a grieving mother, and the rain fell in relentless sheets, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash away the sin that had just been conceived within the dark walls of Blackwood Manor. "The first will be Seraphina," she said, her voice distant, as if the matter were already settled. "She is strong, healthy, and has a compliant nature. Nathaniel, you will be first. It is your duty as the eldest." And there it was, the plan, laid bare in all its monstrous logic. A scheme born of desperation, pride, and an inhuman coldness that defied comprehension. It was a poison that, once spoken, could never be taken back. It seeped into the very foundations of the house, into the hearts of the two young men who were now being asked to become monsters in the name of legacy. Nathaniel stood frozen, trapped between his ingrained duty to his mother and the profound revulsion at her command. Elias looked from his mother's rigid back to his brother's tormented face, and he felt the world fracturing around him. This was not survival. This was the damnation of them all. The storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest in the room. The wind moaned through the eaves like a grieving mother, and the rain fell in relentless sheets, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash away the sin that had just been conceived within the dark walls of Blackwood Manor. The shadow of the past was no longer just a memory of a dead patriarch. It was a living, breathing thing, a darkness that had just been given a name and a purpose. And as Elias stared at his mother's silhouette against the lightning-lit window, a question burned in his mind, a question that would haunt him for the rest of his days. When you are commanded by your own blood to sacrifice the soul of another for the sake of a name, a house, a legacy,
At what point does your own soul cease to exist?
The storm that had broken over Blackwood Manor that night was more than a meteorological event. It was a baptism. When the dawn arrived, it broke over a world that was superficially cleansed. The air scrubbed clean of its humidity, the leaves of the magnolias glistening with a fresh green intensity, the red earth dark and damp and fragrant. But inside the great gray house, the storm had not passed. It had merely moved inward, settling in the souls of the three people who now sat at the heart of a rot that was entirely their own. The air within the walls was stagnant, heavy with the poison of unspoken words and the terrible weight of a command that could not be disobeyed. Silence became the new language of the Blackwood family. It was a silence that had teeth. At breakfast, the clink of Nathaniel's fork against his plate was as loud as a gunshot. The rustle of Elias's newspaper was the sound of a scream being stifled. And Elara presided over it all from the head of the table, her composure a terrifying, placid mask. She sipped her tea, her gaze occasionally drifting to the window, to the fields, as if she were simply contemplating the day's weather. But her sons felt her will like a physical pressure in the room, a force that bent the very air around them. They were no longer just her children, they were instruments. For a week, the command hung in the air, suspended and dreadful. Nathaniel grew gaunt, his movements becoming stiff and mechanical. He spent his days in a fury of activity, driving the overseer, working the enslaved people harder than his father ever had, as if he could outrun his mother's decree through sheer physical exhaustion. But at night, Elias would hear him through the walls, the restless pacing, the groan of the floorboards, the soft, damning clink of a whiskey bottle against a glass. He was a man marching toward his own damnation, and he was trying to do so blind drunk. Elias, in contrast, became still. He was a creature of coiled tension, his every nerve alight with a helpless, burning rage. He watched his brother's self-destruction and his mother's cold patience, and he felt a fire being kindled in the pit of his stomach. It was a fire of pure, unadulterated hatred. He began to watch Seraphina. He would see her from the library window, moving through the yard with a quiet, deliberate grace as she carried laundry or water from the well. She was 19, with skin the color of warm amber and large, dark eyes that held a deep, soulful placidity. There was a dignity about her that seemed to mock the degradation that was being planned for her. Every time Elias saw her, the fire in his gut burned hotter, charring his insides, turning his grief and fear into something harder, something dangerous.
The night it happened, the moon was a bone-white sliver in a sky littered with stars. The air was filled with the hypnotic, deafening chorus of tree frogs and crickets, a sound that usually brought peace, but now seemed to mock the unnatural quiet of the house. Dinner had been another silent, torturous affair. After the plates were cleared, Elara had looked at Nathaniel, just a simple, direct gaze, and had said 2 words. "Tonight, Nathaniel." It was not a question. It was the sealing of a fate. Elias watched his brother rise from the table, his face ashen, his movements like those of a condemned man walking to the gallows. He didn't look at Elias. He couldn't. He walked out of the dining room and toward the back of the house, his heavy footsteps echoing on the polished heart pine floors. Elias remained frozen in his chair, listening. He heard the back door open and close with a soft, final click. And then there was only the sound of the clock in the hall, ticking away the seconds of a life being irrevocably broken. He couldn't bear it. He fled to the veranda, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and stared out into the darkness in the direction of the cabins. The night was impenetrable, but his mind painted the scene with horrifying clarity. He could almost hear the sound of the cabin door opening, could almost see the look of confusion and fear on Seraphina's face. He wrapped his arms around himself, doubling over the railing as a wave of sickness washed over him. This was not a sin he was merely witnessing. He was complicit in it. His silence was his consent. His inaction was his guilt. The fire inside him erupted, and for the first time, it was not just rage. It was shame, a profound, soul-scorching shame. Hours passed. Elias did not move. He waited, a sentinel of shame, until he heard the back door open again. Nathaniel staggered back into the house, a ghost in the moonlight. He stumbled into the parlor and collapsed into a chair, the bottle of whiskey, now half empty, clutched in his hand. Elias followed him in. The room was dark, save for the pale moonlight slanting through the tall windows, striping the floor in bars of silver and black. Nathaniel was a silhouette, his head in his hands. The only sound was his ragged, shuddering breath. "How could you?" Elias's voice was a raw whisper, torn from his throat. Nathaniel didn't look up. "Don't," he rasped, his voice thick with liquor and self-loathing. "Don't you dare speak to me. You think I wanted this?" "You did it," Elias spat, the words like venom. "You walked out there and you did it. You are a monster." Nathaniel finally looked up, and in the moonlight, Elias could see the glint of tears tracking through the grime on his brother's face. "A monster?" he said with a choked, bitter laugh. "She made me a monster. She made us all monsters. This is the price of that name you're so proud of. This is the price of this house, this land." He took a long, desperate pull from the bottle. "She said it was our duty, our survival." "Survival?" Elias's voice rose, cracking with hysteria. "Look at you! Look at what you've become! This isn't survival. This is rot. She is killing our souls to save the dirt beneath our feet." The confrontation shattered something between them. The bond of brotherhood, already strained, now broke entirely. Nathaniel saw in Elias a judge, a sanctimonious coward who stood by and did nothing but condemn. Elias saw in Nathaniel a weakling, a brute who had traded his humanity for his inheritance. From that night on, they were strangers, living in the same house, two planets of grief and anger, orbiting the same cold, distant star that was their mother. The aftermath settled over Blackwood Manor like a plague. Nathaniel became the master his mother wanted, but a twisted, broken version. His commands to the overseer were harsh, his temper explosive. He was a man hollowed out, filled with nothing but whiskey and rage. Seraphina, when she returned to her duties, was changed. The light in her eyes was gone, replaced by a hard, watchful sheen. She moved with the same grace, but her silence was now a wall. She never looked at Nathaniel. She never looked at Elias. She looked through them, as if they were ghosts. Her quiet dignity had been forged into a shield of impenetrable ice. The fire within her had not been extinguished. It had been banked, hidden deep where it could smolder and wait. Elias, consumed by his guilt, began a quiet rebellion. It started small. An extra blanket left near a cabin door on a cold night. A book of letters secretly given to an old man who knew how to read. A quiet word with the cook to ensure a sick child received a larger portion of food.
These were small acts of defiance, tiny sparks against an overwhelming darkness. But they were all he had. They were his penance. But he knew it wasn't enough. As the weeks turned into months, he saw the subtle changes in Seraphina's body, the truth of Nathaniel's crime beginning to show. He saw his mother watching her with a look of cold, triumphant satisfaction. This was not a one-time event. It was the beginning of a dynasty of suffering. The fire in Elias's soul demanded more. It demanded answers. He had to understand the mind that could conceive of such a thing. He began to watch his mother. He studied her routines, her habits, her moments of quiet reflection. He became a shadow in his own home, searching for a crack in her marble facade. He knew she kept meticulous records, just as his father had. But while his father's ledgers were in the study for all to see, Elara's were kept private. He suspected she kept a personal journal, a place where the true thoughts of the queen might be recorded. His chance came during a rare trip she made to Mobile to meet with her bankers. She would be gone for 2 days. The moment her carriage disappeared down the long oak-lined drive, Elias went to her room. He searched her writing desk, her wardrobe, the drawers of her vanity. He found nothing but household accounts, letters from her family in the north, and neatly bundled receipts. He was about to give up when his hand brushed against the floorboards beneath her vanity chair. One of them was loose. His heart hammered in his chest. He pried it up with his fingertips, and there, nestled in the dark space below, was a small, leather-bound book. It was not a plantation ledger. It was a diary. He took it to the library, the one room in the house where he still felt a sliver of peace, and opened it. Her handwriting was as precise and controlled as she was. He skipped past the early entries about her marriage, her arrival at Blackwood, the births of her sons. He went to the months surrounding his father's death. And there he found it, the truth. And it was infinitely more monstrous than he had ever imagined. The debt was real, but it was not crippling. It was a pretext, a tool for manipulation. The true motive lay in a series of entries filled with a cold, venomous rage that stunned him. October 14, 1846, she had written. Theron returns from New Orleans. He stinks of cheap perfume and brandy. He speaks again of the boy, James, his son, his Creole bastard. He speaks of bringing him here, to Blackwood, to this house, my house. He says the boy has potential, the son of a quadroon whore. He dares to suggest that blood is the equal of mine. Elias read on, his hands shaking. His father had had another son, a child with an enslaved woman he had kept in New Orleans. This was the secret that had festered in the heart of their family. But it was the next entry that made the blood freeze in his veins. January 5th, 1847. He is sick. The doctor says it is a lung fever. I say it is a judgment. He wishes to add the boy to his will. He wants to give his bastard a portion of my son's birthright. A stain on the Blackwood name, a name I have bled for, I have sacrificed for. This will not stand. The bloodline must be kept pure. The legacy must be mine to control. And then the final chilling revelation, dated the day after his father's funeral, April 22nd, 1847. The earth has taken him. His weakness is purged from this house, but his stain remains. I will not just erase it, I will overwhelm it. I will create a new Blackwood line, one born of my will, from the bodies of my sons. They will be the sires of a servant class so pure in its Blackwood blood that the very memory of his infidelity will be drowned in a sea of my creation. My legacy will be the only one this land remembers. Nathaniel is strong like his father. He will obey. Elias is soft like my shame. He must be made to understand. This is not about money. It is about purification. It is about revenge. Elias dropped the book as if it had burned him. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. The fire inside him, the fire of shame and rage, now had a name. It was the fire of his mother's vengeance. They were not saving the family. They were instruments in a madwoman's eugenic fantasy, a grotesque act of revenge against a dead man. Seraphina was not a sacrifice for their survival. She was the first victim in a war against a ghost. The child she was carrying was not a commodity. It was a symbol, the first soldier in an army of manufactured purity. This was the moment of irreversible change, the moment the last vestige of his innocence was burned away. He was no longer the son of a desperate widow, but the son of a calculating monster. The sin was not born of necessity, but of a cold, bottomless hatred. He stood up, the diary lying open on the floor like a gaping wound. He walked to the window and looked out at the fields, at the people his mother saw as nothing more than vessels for her vengeance. He saw his brother, Nathaniel, riding across the fields, a silhouette of authority, already a willing, if broken, warden in their mother's prison. The knowledge settled in him, cold and hard as stone. He could not run. He could not hide. He could not simply perform small acts of kindness and call it penance. The evil in this house was not an abstract force. It had a face, a name, and a plan. And as he stood there, the setting sun casting a blood-red light across the landscape, the fire within him coalesced into a single, terrifying purpose. He was not just a witness to this sin. He would be its undoing. The question was no longer what he would do. The question was how. In the deep South, time does not heal all wounds. It preserves them. Like insects trapped in amber, moments of great sin and sorrow are held suspended in the thick, humid air, waiting for the right conditions to be felt again. At Blackwood Manor, 9 months after the storm that had broken the souls of its sons, a new season of suffering was about to be born. The first cry of the child was not a sound of joy. It was a thin, piercing wail that tore through the oppressive silence of the great house, an accusation in sound. It echoed down the long, shadowed hallways and found its way to the ears of the 3 people who were its architects. For Nathaniel, who heard it from the haze of a laudanum-laced whiskey stupor, it was the sound of his own damnation made flesh. For Elara, who heard it from her study, it was the sound of victory, the first note in a symphony of her own design. And for Elias, who stood on the veranda staring out at a sky the color of a fresh bruise, it was a summons. The time for silent rebellion was over. The time for reckoning was at hand. That evening, a new storm gathered, a mirror to the one that had begun their descent into hell. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes like a restless spirit, and the sky grew dark with a premature, unnatural twilight. Elara Blackwood, in an act of breathtaking hubris, ordered a formal dinner. She declared it a celebration of the continuation of the Blackwood line. She commanded her sons to attend, to bear witness to the fruit of their sacrifice.
They gathered in the grand dining hall, the long mahogany table a polished, dark abyss between them. Candles flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the portraits of their ancestors on the walls seem to watch with hollow, judgmental eyes. Nathaniel was there, his face pale and slick with sweat, his hands trembling as he gripped his water goblet. He was sober, a state so unfamiliar to him now that it seemed a sickness in itself. Elias was a statue of coiled stillness, his face carved from stone, his eyes holding a cold, clear fire. At the head of the table, Elara sat enthroned, a black silk dress making her look like a queen of shadows. She was radiant with a terrible, triumphant energy. "A son," she announced, her voice ringing with satisfaction. "Seraphina has delivered a healthy boy, strong lungs. He has the Blackwood look about him, I am told." She looked at Nathaniel, a flicker of something almost like pride in her icy eyes. "You have done your duty well, Nathaniel. You have secured our future." Nathaniel flinched as if struck. He stared down at his empty plate, his jaw working silently. Elias placed his hands flat on the table. The small, soundless gesture drew his mother's attention. "We need to talk about the future, Mother," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "But to do that, we must first speak of the past, the real past." Elara's smile tightened. "Elias, do not be morose." "Was it a triumph?" Elias continued, his voice dropping lower, cutting through the rising moan of the wind. "When you discovered Father's other son, the one in New Orleans?" The name hung in the air, a ghost suddenly given form. Nathaniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with confusion. Elara's face, for the first time, lost its perfect composure. A hairline crack appeared in the marble. "You don't know what you're talking about," she hissed. "Oh, I do," Elias said, and with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into his coat and produced the small, leather-bound diary. He placed it on the table between them. It lay there like a dark heart. "I know the debt was a lie," Elias said, his voice a steady, damning cadence. "A story you wove to justify what you wanted to do all along. This was never about survival." He opened the book, his fingers tracing the elegant, venomous script. He began to read. He read of Elara's jealousy, her wounded pride, her obsessive rage at her husband's infidelity. He read of her fear that a Creole bastard would inherit a piece of her son's legacy. He read the words that condemned them all. "My legacy will be the only one this land remembers. This is not about money. It is about purification. It is about revenge." When he finished, a profound silence fell over the room, broken only by the howl of the wind and a sudden sharp crack of thunder that shook the house to its foundations. Nathaniel stared at his mother, his face a canvas of utter devastation. The last pillar of his justification, the idea that his monstrous act had been a necessary duty to save his family, had been pulverized. He had not been a soldier. He had been a weapon, a tool of vengeance in a petty war with a dead man. "You?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You made me? For that? For your pride?" "It was for this family," Elara shot back, her voice shrill, her control finally shattering. "To protect our blood, to cleanse the stain your father tried to put on our name. I did what was necessary to protect what is ours." "Ours?" Nathaniel roared, surging to his feet so violently that his chair crashed to the floor. The table shuddered and the candle flames danced wildly. "You speak of blood? You had me defile our own. You had me create a child born of sin and rage, a child you see as nothing but a tool, and you call it purification?" He lunged across the table, sweeping glasses and silverware aside, his face contorted with a grief so profound it looked like madness. "You have destroyed me. You have destroyed us all." He did not strike her. His rage was too vast, too internal for such a simple act. He turned, his eyes wild and unfocused, and stared at the portrait of his father that hung over the mantelpiece. With a guttural cry of pure anguish, he grabbed a heavy silver candlestick from the table and hurled it at the painting. It struck the canvas with a sickening thud, tearing a jagged gash across Theron Blackwood's placid, painted face. But it was not enough. The fire of his shame, stoked by the truth, needed to burn. He grabbed a candelabra, the flames licking at his hands, and stalked toward the study, the room where the sin had been conceived. "Nathaniel!" Elara screamed, but her voice was lost in his wake. Elias watched, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had lit the fuse, and now the world was exploding. He followed his brother, not to stop him, but to witness.
The fire took hold with an unholy speed, feeding on the dry old wood and paper, on the bourbon-soaked rugs, on the very air thick with generations of secrets. Smoke, thick and black, began to pour from the room. The house, which had stood for decades, began to groan and pop, the sound of a great beast dying. In the midst of the chaos, a new figure appeared in the hallway, framed by the hellish orange glow from the study. It was Seraphina. She was not panicked. She stood with a preternatural calm, her face serene, her eyes clear. In her arms, wrapped in a simple cotton blanket, was the baby. Elara saw her, and, for a moment, her own madness took over. She rushed toward Seraphina, her hands outstretched. "Give me the boy!" she shrieked over the roar of the fire. "He is a Blackwood! He is mine!" Seraphina did not flinch. She took one step back, her gaze locking with Elara's. The power dynamic, for the first time in their lives, had been inverted. The enslaved woman, the vessel, was now the one in control. "His name," Seraphina said, her voice quiet but carrying with absolute clarity over the din, "is emancipation." The name was a judgment, a prophecy, a declaration of war. It struck Elara with more force than any physical blow. It was the ultimate act of defiance, stealing the very identity of her creation, turning her symbol of control into a symbol of freedom. She stared, speechless, as Elias moved to stand beside Seraphina, a silent protector. The fire spread. Flames began to lick up the grand staircase. The portrait of Theron Blackwood was consumed, his painted eyes melting away into nothing. Nathaniel was lost in the inferno of the study, his screams of rage and pain finally silenced by the blaze he had created, a final, terrible act of purification. Elias grabbed Seraphina's arm. "We have to go, now!" He led her and the child out the back, away from the collapsing facade of their lives, into the rain-swept darkness of the night. They didn't look back. Behind them, Blackwood Manor, the kingdom built on cotton and control, the monument to a legacy of sin, was being consumed by the fire from within. It burned against the night sky, a great roaring pyre for a family that had destroyed itself. The curse of Blackwood Manor was never a ghost or a demon that haunted its halls. The curse was the human heart and its infinite capacity for pride and vengeance. It was the belief that a legacy of property and power was worth more than a legacy of humanity. Elara Blackwood had sought to create a pure bloodline to erase a stain, but in doing so, she had created a poison that rotted her family from the inside out.
Her revenge was fulfilled not on her dead husband, but on her own children, on herself, and on the very name she sought to preserve. She was the only one who survived the night, found wandering the smoldering grounds the next morning by neighbors, her fine black dress covered in ash, her jet-black hair now streaked with a shocking, ghostly white. She had lost everything: her house, her sons, her legacy. All that remained was the name of a child she would never know: emancipation. She lived out her days in the ruins of her own making, a silent, mad queen ruling over an empire of ash and memory. Elias, Seraphina, and the boy vanished into the night, swallowed by the great unknown promise of the North Star. Their story became a whisper, a piece of the forgotten history of that land.
Some sins are so profound they stain the soil forever. They become a part of the landscape, a cold spot in the summer air, a whisper in the rustling leaves. The story of Elara Blackwood is not just a tale of a single family's descent into madness. It is a reflection of a sickness that poisoned the heart of a nation. It reminds us that the greatest horrors are not supernatural, but are born in the quiet, desperate chambers of the human soul, fueled by pride and a hunger for control. The past never truly sleeps. It just waits for someone to remember. Where are you listening from tonight? Because some say the past never truly sleeps. It just waits for someone to remember.